Well, good evening, and welcome to the University of Pikeville for all of our guests who are here every day. Welcome back. For those who are visiting us tonight, we're so glad you could join us up on the hill. We want to give you a couple of very critical announcements. Number one, this may be the most critical thing that I say all night to you. If you need to use the restroom tonight, immediately out these doors to my right, to your left, you're going to find bathrooms right out there. We ask that you use those restrooms tonight so that you're going to disrupt down here, coming all the way down here. Also, for respect for everyone's participation tonight of this experience, we ask that you would mute your cell phones or turn it off. And I know that's kind of a hard, shocking statement, but there is an off button on all cell phones, so you could use that. Anyways, in saying that, I want to welcome you to our 4th annual Carol Grizzard Browning lecture. And tomorrow night we'll be back here for part 2 of our lecture series, which we're really excited about. Once a year, the University of Pikeville takes time to dedicate and focus in on our religious heritage and tradition. We know that in the year 1889, I want to try again, 1889, Presbyterians founded the school in belief that the children of the mountains deserved quality education. And now for 126 years, we've been trying to be faithful to that mission. And a part of that is religious scholarship and thinking about what does it mean to do good, both with our minds, our hearts, and our hands. So tonight is one ripple in that long stream. And because of that, the university offers many different opportunities for you to participate, not only intellectually, but also spiritually. One of the new things that we'll be starting here in November, I want to give you a sneak peek about, is November 18th. Starting in the chapel, you might see some flyers hanging up all over campus. There's going to be a meditation group starting on November 18th, which we would love for you to participate in. If you're interested in meditation, come see me, and we'll talk further about how we can plug you in to that. Now, I would like to call your attention to the insert that hopefully you received tonight. And on the front side, you're going to notice that there is a beautiful woman with a stack of books. And this is Dr. Carol Grizzard Browning. Dr. Carol Grizzard Browning taught at then Pikeville College for 23 years. She preached in churches in the area. She's authored or edited many different books, which you're going to see here. Her specialty in lifelong work was looking at 1st and 2nd Samuel. In addition to the many books that she edited and articles she produced, Carol created many class materials, lecture notes, syllabi charts, handouts, and sermons, which now, in this past year, have been compiled by her husband, Dr. James Browning. Carol retired early due to some health issues. A progressive neurological disorder cut short her academic career and prevented her from bringing that career to full closure. Carol was a scholar and a teacher who created her own legacy. Carol combined wisdom with compassion, investing herself in the lives of her students. When she retired, the religion majors gave her a quilt. Included in the quilt are pieces of fabric that each student contributed. The inscription reads as following: "To Carol Grizzard Browning, your fingerprints will never fade from the lives you've touched. Each person who was touched by Carol preserves her legacy as well." And I know, as a person who, having not been in Carol's classroom and never having the privilege of teaching beside Carol, I still feel the imprint of Carol's legacy when I'm in the classroom, but especially when I'm out in area churches. No matter how big a smile I have, no matter how dynamic I think I am, when I leave the area Presbyterian churches, the one question they have for me is, how is Carol Grizzard Browning? Because she made such an impact on the local churches. So we come these 2 nights at 7 o'clock in honor of Carol, of her life, of compassion, and scholarship. And so we're very excited for our guest tonight. On the second side, you're going to notice that we have a nice bio of our speaker tonight. And I want to kind of call your attention to what is said here in the bulletin. But also, just a side note, our speaker has come and traveled quite a long day to be here and right on time, so we're so thankful for her time. The Venerable Robina Courtin, ordained since the late 1970s, she has worked full-time since then for Lama Tubin Yeshi and Lama Zofin Rinpoche, and I just butchered those names, I'm very sorry, I apologize, for the Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition. Over the years, she has served as editorial director of Wisdom Publications, editor of Mandala magazine, and her books include How to Meditate, A Practical Guide, Becoming the Compassionate Buddha, and also The Bliss of Inner Fire, Heart Practice of 6 Yogas of Naropa. She has served as the executive director of Liberation Prison Project and as a touring teacher in Buddhism. Her life and work with prisoners have been featured in the documentary films Chasing Buddha and Key to Freedom. Tonight I want to show you the trailer to one of these films known as Chasing Buddha. And then, after the trailer is presented, if you would greet our guest with a warm welcome.
Well, I'm happy to be here. My first time in Pikeville, Kentucky. And I'll probably have to speak slowly. You have to speak slowly as well, I tell you. The very first time I heard a Southern American accent, I was working in London in the 60s when I was an old hippie. When I worked for this little agency and some American was renting a car and he said his name was Bale. And I couldn't hear it. I said, Bale? He says, as in ding dong. You're supposed to laugh. I couldn't understand. So if you have to speak, you've got to speak slowly. But I have been living in this country for quite a while and I am an American now, so as well as an Australian. So I should be able to understand you. I'm kind of joking. So that movie was made by my nephew when he was 19 in Australia, quite a few years ago actually. And very fortunately, the prison, which is in Kentucky, we've been actually in Eddyville. I've just been there this morning. The first fellow with the beard, I've known him for nearly 20 years now. I've been visiting him. He's on death row and he's getting close to his death date. So on the way here, we visited. We're just driven from Eddyville, 6 hours, 7 hours. I get to see him every year. So the work I started to do in prison was when I was based in California, editing a Buddhist magazine, and I got a letter. It was about maybe a few years ago. We got a letter from this young, I was editing a magazine, I got a letter from this young Mexican-American guy from Los Angeles who was in prison in California. And he told me that he'd been in gangs since he was 11, in prison since he was 12, and then tried as an adult at the age of 16 and given 3 life sentences. So, you know, the sentencing was quite severe. He didn't kill anybody because the gang activity in Los Angeles is so intense. He's got this intense long sentence. I just saw him recently too. It's been now 25 years since he's been in prison. And just now in California, thank you, it's marvellous, they've now they're trying to find a way that when juveniles, you know, were tried as adults, see if they can get out sooner. Because the sentencing is so severe, you know. So this letter came, and I wrote a letter, wrote back, sent it a book, and within a year I had 40 people writing letters to us. And so the whole project that we ended up calling Liberation Prison Project started from there. So these people basically in prison started in California, but then it was word of mouth. And I ran that for many years, maybe 14 years now. Another colleague of mine is running it. I still have contact with many people in prison and visit prisons. But essentially what we did was, because people heard about us and wanted to read a book, you know, they'd heard about meditation, they'd heard about Buddhism, and there are these people in prison, and of course you probably know that in this country, the number of people in prisons in this country is 10 times or more than anywhere else on earth, per head of population as well as in real terms, you know. And I think, and I can say from visiting prisons in all over Australia, all over Europe, in Asia, the sentencing here is really severe. You know, I can't imagine a crime. Maybe crime here is worse. Maybe not. I'm not sure. But the sentencing is extremely severe. But what's interesting for me is this is not a political statement, because people started to write to us. There were people who had these long sentences. Most of them young men. You know, been in the wrong place at the wrong time, had guns, or been in gangs. Many of them have been in gangs. They were there they were sitting in these garbage dump places, because prisons aren't very pleasing. You wouldn't choose to go live in the prison. The architecture's not so nice. The food's pretty terrible. The company is sometimes not so cool. You know, and so you know then you're bored and you want something to do. And most of them, I have to say, and I would say over those years, we probably had contact with 25,000 people in prison, individuals in Australia and America who wrote to us. So I would say 99% of them, working class, uneducated, had been in gangs, no family, no money. I mean, because as we all know, when you have money, you can hire the rich lawyers, and no matter how bad you've been, you can probably get out, you know. So it's kind of was really just incredible eye-opener for me. I haven't been to prisons. I haven't been sent to prison. And so for me it was very moving because ordinary human beings in the wrong, the wrong place at the wrong time, and the ones who wanted something from us were clearly really the wackos and the psychos, they wouldn't write to us, they didn't want to learn to meditate, but it was the human beings who wanted to do something with themselves. They couldn't get out of prison, so they wanted to educate themselves. I mean, many of these guys have no education. And so this young man, Arturo, who was 16 when he first went to adult prison, he's now 42, 41 or something, I saw him recently as well. And he had no education. He was in gangs since he was 11. So when you're sitting in your cell 23 hours a day in these top security cells, in the prison he was in California, it was against human rights, where you'd be in your cell 23 hours a day, with just you were allowed to have 10 books. No hard back because you can whack your cellmate. The inside of a pen, you can't have the hard part because you can stab your cellmate. It was really severe, very severe. The noise was unbelievable. As they said to me, it was like being in a rock concert all day. And there you are with nothing else to do. You either go crazy or you start to work on yourself. You don't have much choice, you can't get out. There's nothing to do. And so this is why he wrote to us, and then the people who then did write to us. And so, of course, because we're Buddhist, they wrote for Buddhist things. They didn't have to be a Buddhist. So the key thing for me, I'm a Buddhist, and maybe I'll talk about what Buddhists think if you want. But the key thing is I don't want to convert people. One of the things in Buddhism, it's sort of considered really inappropriate to try and convert people. That's not the thing at all. If no one asks you what you think, you would never say it, I mean, I would say in my family, I've got 6 siblings. I've been a Buddhist now for more than half my life. I could probably count 5 conversations we've ever had because they don't ask me. We all love each other for who we are, but we don't talk about it, so I don't say anything, Why should I? Yourself, if you're not interested in something, there's nothing worse than somebody else shoving it down your throat, So these people who would write to us, they wanted what we had, so we would send books. So for me, the key thing, and this is, I suppose, the essence of the Buddhist approach, the key thing I wanted to give to human beings was tools to help them know their own mind and develop their qualities. If they ended up becoming a Buddhist, or I don't care, that's not my business. But the key thing I would say, being a Buddhist, is to know your mind. So Buddhism, it's interesting, I'll maybe mention this briefly. Buddhism doesn't happen to talk about a soul, but Buddhism uses the word mind or consciousness, and they're referring not just to your thoughts, but your feelings, your emotions, your unconscious, your subconscious, this entire spectrum of your inner being. And being a Buddhist, the key thing is to become very familiar with the workings of yourself, so you can learn to lessen the neuroses and the misery and the anger and the fears and the jealousy, which is the stuff that we know causes us suffering and what causes us to make a mess of our lives, on the one side, and then on the other side, we become more qualified to then be of benefit to others, because we all live in the same boat in this crazy world, don't we, So the Buddhist spiritual approach is surely all about compassion, like any good human being. It's about helping others. The Buddhist idea is you've got to kind of put yourself together first. Because if you're caught up in your own misery, your own self-centeredness, your own depression, your own anger, your own hurt, you can't help a dog, So there's this nice analogy in Buddhism that a bird needs 2 wings, wisdom and compassion. And you could say the compassion wing is the point. That's where you put your money where your mouth is. That's where you help others. But the wisdom wing is where you get to know yourself well and you put yourself together. Not in a self-centered way, but in a practical way. And that basically means, in simple sense, learning to know your own misery, and your anger, and your depression, and your jealousy, and learning to take responsibility for it, because life is tough. Bad things happen to us, there's no question. And I can see this among my friends in prison. These days there's a lot of talk about people on death row who are being accused inappropriately, people being in prison for 25 years, and the DNA evidence is proving that they're innocent. So, you can't imagine that kind of suffering. So, learning to deal, because you can't, there's a saying in Buddhism, if you can change something, please change it. But if you can't, then what do? What choice have you got? To work on yourself. And the whole Buddhist approach, and the thing is, Buddhism doesn't own this idea. We can all see it's true. It's just that it's very hard. Because, if the situation you're in, the lousy relationship, the lousy school, the lousy family, the lousy job, It's easy for us to get completely caught up, to blame other people and feel hopeless. But if we can leave the job or leave the relationship, great, and then fantastic, but sometimes we can't. And that's clearly the situation with people in prison. They haven't got the luxury of walking out, you know? And many of them, especially on death row, not to mention life sentences, or even long sentences. And so it's natural in prison that many people get very depressed, they kill each other, they kill themselves. But the tools that, you know, over the years we've been trying to give people who wrote to us, with these Buddhist tools that talks about learning to know your own mind. So for me, you know, this man I met that came sort of day in Eddyville, the guy with the beard, the first one, he's on death row. He was, you know, the other guy after that, one of his friends, they're both there together. I think they've been there 30 years, because that's how long appeals take when you're on death row. They were dealing drugs. I mean, they weren't such evil people. You know, they had wives and kids. They were dealing drugs, and there were guns. When you have guns, people die, you know. So 3 people died, and so they're on death row as a result. And so, of course, the shock at the beginning, and then they learned to put themselves together. And Mitch became a Buddhist over those years, you know. And so I can say with certainty, this fellow, he's 50-something now, he's a grandfather, he lives a really good life. He's content with himself, he's happy. I mean, we spent 2 hours together, we just cracked jokes the whole time, you know. Even though he's on death row, it sounds shocking to us. Because he's accepted his reality, he knows he can't change it. He's waiting for his death date to come. As he said, Robina, I'm ready for that electric jolt. You know, today also he said, I've decided for the best attitude to have when they execute me, and I think already he's working on that now, to have compassion for the people who have to kill him, you know, so I don't get angry. So this kind of thing. And this is what I find very moving about people. When you're in a situation that you can't change, that's when either the worst or the best of us comes out, isn't it, you know? So I see with him, he's really done a great job of his life. He takes care of his, you know, his nephews and nieces and grandchildren, his mother, his father, his wife. He does drawings, he writes poetry, and he takes care of his 30 inmates, his friends on death row. They all live there together. You know, he takes care of each one of them. Some guy he talked about today who's quite psychotic. He can't do much to help him, so he's kind to him, and then he maybe go do some prayers for him. You know? So somehow I find great admiration for people I've known over these years, who are in a situation due to something they did wrong, but have been able to turn their lives around, but also not to spend all their time trying to get out of prison. Even if you're innocent, you really go mad sometimes. I remember reading years ago about one woman in Florida who was hitching with her husband and their 3 kids. And then they got picked up by 2 guys, and then the cops stopped the guys, and then the guys killed the cops, but blamed the others, blamed the husband and wife. So then they were on death row in Florida, you know. And the husband even gets executed. I mean, can you imagine the nightmare of this? You go completely crazy. And she was this remarkable, she lost her kids, the husband got executed. She was there for 17 years, and eventually she got out because she was innocent. And she said at some point, you can only imagine the process she had to go through, the internal process. She said, I realized I couldn't change anything, but they could not take my mind from me. So I decided, I'm not a prisoner, I'm a monk. I'm not in a cell, I'm in a cave. So this is really quite profound, you know. And if we look into our own lives and someone accuses you, even the smallest thing that you didn't do, look at the torture, look at the suffering. Sometimes we can never let go of it, we can never forgive. We kind of completely go crazy. So you can only imagine being accused of murder and you're on death row and you're innocent. 17 years, you know, but she realized she couldn't change. And this is so unusual, but many of the people I know like this. Instead of constantly being miserable, constantly suffering, constantly angry, constantly depressed, because they cannot change their situation. And this is the point. This is, as I'm saying, this we all understand it. It's not as if the Buddha owns this view, but it happens to be the key point in Buddhism. To know your mind and change it. To change the way you think. To change the way you interpret things. And it's kind of, life is a minefield. We know life is very difficult. And of course the Buddhist approach would say the key reason we find this job so hard is because we're kind of addicted to the idea that my happiness comes from out there and my suffering comes from out there. So we're always looking for the nice people, the nice job, the nice handbag, the nice meal, the nice event, the nice music, because we're convinced when we get that, then we'll get happy. And then of course as soon as you lose that, then we think that I'll get suffering. So the Buddhist approach is totally focusing only on that. You know, you're left empty because you can't guarantee We all know that from our lives. Whether we're 15 or 95, we know we can't guarantee we'll get everything we want all the time. Things change. People stop liking us. Husbands divorce us. Bosses fire us. We can see life is like this. And so only focusing on the outside. And in Buddhist view, this is not some kind of moralistic thing, like you're not allowed to have money and fun. Of course, much money and fun as you like. But the whole Buddhist idea is totally focusing only on that as if that's the main cause of your happiness. You've got to be in trouble. Because when you don't get what you want, or when you get what you don't want, then you're left with misery in the mind. And this is my example of my friends in prison. I have such admiration for them. I mean, these are the teachings I give them, and they're the ones who really put it into practice. I go off to Starbucks and order my coffee and it's not quite hot enough. And I complain, my God, excuse me. So they're great examples for me, I can say anything. Chat away, you can start asking me questions. I don't know how we do this, I think it's good to ask me some questions and I can see where to go. We can start talking whatever you like. So I have no expectation about what to say or do or anything. Yeah?
What brought you to Buddhism?
Okay, thank you. Well, I was brought up a Catholic in Melbourne, in Australia. 7 kids in the family, and it was from the very beginning. I was very devoted. I loved God. I was total Catholic. Wanted to be when I first went to Mass, I decided I'd be a priest. And I announced it to the family. Well, of course, they all laughed and said, you can't be a priest, you're a boy, So they said, you have to be a nun. So I figured. So it was interesting in my childhood. I was very rebellious and always the worst kid at school and the worst kid at home. But at the same time, I always think about the meaning of God, the meaning of life, what is happiness, what is suffering, these kind of things. I didn't talk about it much. My other sisters didn't think about it. But it was a big part of my life, reading about these things. But at the same time, also very naughty, So I think when I was about 13 or 12, I begged my mother to let me be a nun, like one of these holy saints, She wouldn't let me, of course. So I cried. And then 20 years later, when I became a Buddhist nun, she cried. And I said to her, oh, Mum, it's all the same. And she said, well, it's all the same, why did you change? Which is a pretty logical statement, I couldn't say anything. Anyway, the process for me, I think, without trying to sound all noble about it, I always think what interested me, ever since I was a kid, was the meaning of life, this kind of thing. Why happiness? Why suffering? Why is there good? Why is there bad? It's just how my mind was, So at first I was Catholic, and then when I was 19, sort of around the 60s, the hippie time. So I decided, okay, by God, hello boys. So it was lots of sex and drugs and jazz. When I was 15, a very powerful experience for me when I was 15. This is in Melbourne, Australia. This quiet little kind of city. This is like the 1950s. I've never seen any other cultures. I've never seen any other races except, white Christians. I didn't even meet a Jew. Just nice white Christians in my country, And so I remember heard for the first time, some jazz, black American music. And it kind of blew my mind, opened me up to the whole new world, I remember it was a Billie Holiday record. I remember it was this 7-inch LP, and I said to myself, I wonder who he is, But I kind of fell to buy it. And from there, I think I started, my religious aspirations started becoming kind of more social, about the suffering in the world, why is there suffering, what is, this kind of business. And then I got to 19, that was hippie time, so it was, oh my God, hello boys. And then I went to London and Europe in the 60s. That was I think I was ripe and ready for revolution around that time. So very radical politics, demonstrations and everything. And then very strongly also supporting, at the time of all especially the time of the States, for some reason I was very involved then with people in prison. This is before I became a Buddhist. This is 40 years before I became a Buddhist. And I was working supporting different people supporting the Black Panthers in America. I was always a bit radical, And so radical left me for a while, and then black politics, and then feminist politics. I was a very strong feminist. And by that point, I think, I don't know, when I was a Catholic, all the non-Catholics were the problem. And then when I became hippie, all the straight people were the problem. And then I became into radical left politics, all the rich people were the problem. And then I was into sort of black politics, all the white people were the problem. When I got to female politics, all the male people were the problem. So I think by that point I've exhausted all options. For who caused the problems in the world. And then I bumped into these Buddhists, and they told me I should look at myself. Well, that was a brand new idea. I never thought of looking at myself and knowing my own mind, you know. So I've been doing that ever since. Trying to, so it's been an evolution. Does it make sense what I'm saying?
It makes sense.
Yes.
Recently, as I understand, you mentioned feminism. Isn't it true that the Dalai Lama stated that upon his passing, he would be perfectly comfortable with a woman becoming a Dalai Lama?
Yeah, I think, yes, for sure. The way they talk about it is that, you know, whatever's most beneficial. Whatever works, you know. Yeah, for sure. No problem. I mean, Buddhism has come from a very patriarchal society. In Asia, you know, it was very patriarchal. But I think it adjusts to the society. So clearly in our society, things are quite different. Yeah. Come on, you people. If you ask me a question, I know what you want to hear. Maybe I'll bore you to tears, so I don't want to do that. So ask me anything you like. Any old question, I don't mind. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Well, I didn't, you know, technically I didn't choose it. I went to this particular course, and that's what I felt I'd found what I wanted, and so I've been that ever since. But if I analyse it since then, I think it's the emphasis on this. I like this analogy of the bird needs two wings. You've got to, you know, the cliched idea, I think, in the world about being a Buddhist, you kind of sit there watching your navel, you know, you walk slowly and you be mindful. Well, it's a bit of a cliche, really. It's quite a cliche, really. The job is to know yourself well. And that's what they mean by developing wisdom. Because when you lessen your anger and your fears and your neuroses and your jealousy and your depression, then you get more clear, and then you can adapt and see other people more clearly. Which means you can now do the second one, the compassion wing, which is help others. And that just suits my nature, you know, in this life. I'm into action and doing things, you know, it just suits me. So, you know, it suits me, it just suits my nature. And it's the emphasis on helping others. Which is, yeah. Does that make sense? Okay. What else, people? Yes?
Couldn't you say that anybody can be a Buddhist? I mean, it's not really a specific religion, it's just an approach to how you try to...
Yeah, I understand, exactly. You could say, the way to put it, I think, because strictly speaking, it's not what we would call a belief system. So you tell me if you disagree with this, but this is my own view. When I was a Catholic, clearly I had faith in God. God is a superior being who is the creator of me, the creator of the universe. And also, by definition, I remember asking a Jesuit priest friend of mine, I said, by definition, what is a sin? He said, by definition, it's doing what God said you shouldn't do. So naturally, if I do something wrong, it's because God said, so that I should ask forgiveness. And that's our view, isn't it? Pretty much our view. If you're a Muslim, if you're a Christian, if you're a Catholic, whatever, it's the creator, he's the source of the universe and the source of you, broadly speaking, isn't it? Well, the Buddhist view is not like that at all. So Buddha, you know, is this, you could say, was this regular guy who actually came out of this pretty incredible Indian tradition, which is pretty, I think most of us in the West don't know much about the Indian. Why would we? It's not our culture. But these amazing Indians, more than 3,000 years ago, before Buddha, who came out of that tradition, they were the ones who cultivated, cultivated this particular meditation technique that these days is known as, broadly speaking, is known as mindfulness, which is the kind of the idea of what people think of as meditation. You close your eyes, you sit a certain way, and what you're really doing, this technique that these amazing Indians developed, was it's actually this really refined, disciplined, psychological technique that enables you to go to a subtler, more refined level of your own mind, which I think in our psychological model is not even posited as existing. And not just a space out there, so that you can learn to completely change the mind, stop all the craziness and the uncontrolled thoughts and feelings and emotions. And it's a really sophisticated skill when you accomplish it that enables you to see your own mind at the deepest level and to really fundamentally change it and to get rid of all the rubbish, all the nonsense, all the emotional confusions and the fears and the dramas. So this is really where Buddha came out of this, from this tradition. So he diverged in his own direction, in relationship to particular points. But the whole point of it all was to learn to understand the very nature of who we are, you know. It's really like internally understanding what is a human being, what is negativity, what is positive, what is happiness, what is suffering. And that's the stuff that Buddhism deals with, the internal part. And on the basis of accomplishing your own nirvana, as they call it, which is just this word that really you use to refer to your own mind at this subtle level, when you've done the job and you're radically changing yourself. You understand? And so technically you can say anyone can do that. You know, you don't need to, and it's not a question of believing in it. I mean, belief, I know as a Catholic, belief plays a huge role. Because, you know, it will be considered the worst rudeness, I think, to try and prove God to be right. Isn't that true? Are some of you people Christian? No answers. Are some of you people Christian? So it will be considered extremely arrogant to prove God right or wrong. Would that be right? You have faith in God, don't you? Because necessarily you can't prove what God says to be true. Is that right or not? Is that right? And I see that amazing good in that. I think that's fantastic. That just happens not to be the Buddha's view. The Buddha says he, you know, through this process that he went through, he's basically what Buddhism is laying down Buddha's own methodology of how he got to this certain stage of inner development. And he basically said, now it's up to you. If you want to do this, you can achieve it as well. So doing this process that he went through is the point, you know. It's not so much believing in it, but doing it. The Buddhism even uses the term superior being, but not in the way that Christians do. So there's many kind of, you can say there are many similar findings, but some fundamentally different views. So the other point, of course, is you don't need to be 100% Buddhist. You can be 1% Buddhist. You can take, I mean, I remember a few years ago, one of the Catholic nuns, who was of the same order of nuns who educated me, she wanted me to put her into a meditation retreat for 2 weeks. So I gave her these different Buddhist books to read, all about the mind, and she said it increased her own faith. You know, she used these tools to help enhance her own practice. And I've seen that. And the Dalai Lama, for example, he has many wonderful conversations. Some of his dearest friends are Christians and people and they have really good communication with each other. So in many ways you can say that there are tools in Buddhism, of course, that anyone can use if they choose. From the big picture point of view, which is also my interest, Buddhism, basically, like Christianity, is an entire world view. This is where the whole idea of karma comes in, which is a huge one from the Buddhist view. But basically, Buddha says our consciousness goes back and back and back. No one creates us, and our own actions themselves, second by second, kind of program our own mind that produce our own suffering and own happiness, not just in this life, but from life to life. So the whole that bigger picture that's studied in great depth in all the Buddhist literature, many people might be interested in that. You understand? But the techniques of understanding the mind and meditation, they're open to anybody. So it's up to one. You know, often I say you can be a 1% Buddhist, and it's a question of taking the tools that work for you. You don't have to jump in the deep end. You know, it happens to be for me. I want the big picture. I like that big picture, and that's the one I'm working with. You know, in my life. Does that make sense? Yeah. Anybody else? Yes.
What about in all these years of experience in prisons?
Yes.
You go in and they ask you questions and all this. What have they taught you? What have you learned from them?
Oh, what I've learned from them is just immense. The main point, as I mentioned before, you know, when, you know, there they are in these garbage dumps. For whatever reason, I'm not saying they're innocent victims, I'm not saying that. But there you are in these places where everything is not pleasant. The environment is ugly most of the time. The food is disgusting. The company isn't the best. You know, you're treated like an animal. Mostly it's a very strong view if you're in prison, especially if you kill people, you're on death row. If you've been a gangster, you're seen as like an animal. You're treated often in the prisons. I mean, I'm almost shocked sometimes how badly people in prison are seen. You know, and there's a very strong feeling that once you're a criminal, you're always a criminal. You understand? So for me, I found it very moving. These human beings who wrote to us, who wanted something, and I was happy to give them the tools. And then, of course, one of the big tools we had was, the main program we had was the people who write to us. So it's very hard to go to prison. The country's pretty big and there are so many prisons in this country. And then what you do is you go back next month and then you move to another prison. So what we've established is a system of mentors. So we had a couple of hundred people around the world. So people would write. We'd give them to one of the mentors. We'd send them books and they would write to each other. And that was really marvellous because what I found that many of these people had no friends, no family, no one. So they have one human being you can write to and just help you in whatever way you want. Some wanted serious Buddhism, some a good friend. It was a very marvellous thing that we could offer. So for me, what I found was this is the courage of a person living in a garbage dump where you can't have any freedom to even pick your nose in peace, where you're seen as an animal, the food is disgusting, everything is disgusting, but you're able to really put into practice these things that I say I'm supposed to be teaching. And they're showing me, I mean, it really has been very comforting for me. You know, how easily you get upset when the slightest thing is wrong, how easily you're offended when people insult you, or your coffee isn't the nicest possible, or the temperature isn't right. Whereas in these places, you just have no freedom. You either go mad, or you completely find the way to find your own way in it to be happy, and to use the tools that you've got to transform your mind, but you can't transform anything else. That for me has been the most moving, because that's exactly what they're the tools I give them, so it's really humbling when I see them truly put it into practice. I'm not trying to say they're all saints, I'm not saying that, but the ones who really do, when I meet my friend today, Mitch, you know, there he is in his red jumpsuit, he lives in his red jumpsuit. Everywhere he goes, he has to be escorted. He's hardly had any possessions, but he's learned to really find a worthwhile life. He helps all the guys on death row who spend most of their time in their cells, completely depressed, just watching television, totally wasting their lives, completely depressed, living on drugs and pills, you know. Whereas he's found a way to be truly helpful. You know, it's very inspiring. When you've got so little freedom, but you really find some freedom. It's not a cliche. It's internal freedom. That's the thing for me, most moving. So it inspires me to be more authentic in doing the things that I say to them, you know, to do it myself. Do you understand? Yes.
So, describe for me the afterlife that might be involved with Buddhism. You know, Christianity.
Yes.
Lost big time. And where's this all?
I understand. Well, yeah, in this way, the Buddhist view is very, very different. Okay, I'll tell you. So the Buddhist view would be that, what's your name?
My name? Daryl.
Daryl. Okay, here's Daryl, okay? It's very different, you'll see, very different view. You did ask me, so I'll tell you. The Buddhist view is that your mind, your consciousness, they use these words synonymously, not physical. They don't talk about a soul, but you can effectively talk about a subtler level of your mind is like that. So your gross consciousness is your anger, your jealousy, your love, your kindness, your sensory. And then you've got a subtler level of consciousness. And then at the time of death, Daryl's consciousness, kind of basically programmed by the way he lived his life, then will be sort of, it's a highly complex process, but that consciousness will leave this body. And then depending on the programming, and that's really, I mean, that's the way they talk about karma. Karma just means everything you think and do and say leaves seeds in your mind that will produce fruits like that in the future. I mean, it's a highly complex process, but the crucial point in Buddhism, there's nobody who's judging or rewarding. The Buddha would say this is a natural law that occurs in every mind, every dog, every human, every sentient being. Every being is driven by, programmed by their own thoughts, their own feelings, their own verbal and physical actions, and all that stuff kind of programs them. That's the best way to say it. So that when you die, your consciousness will leave the body and it will take another rebirth. And it's all just kind of, it's a natural law, he says. And that type of rebirth will be depending on whether you know, the virtuous or the non-virtuous seeds were most prevalent. So in general, the Buddhist view would be virtuous actions, patience, loving, kind, forgiving, non-killing, non-stealing, non-harming, a very conscious, intentional way to live your life like that as a good person. That programs your mind with virtuous imprints, so that will bring happy results. For Buddha, it's a natural law that virtue produces happiness and non-virtue produces suffering. And like I said, it's not a moralistic thing. You're not getting punished or rewarded because Buddha doesn't assert something like that. He says it's a natural law that occurs in every mind every second. So that's why he says we need to be in touch with our mind so we can be in charge of this process and stop us being a victim and feel everybody else is the cause of our happiness, everybody else is the cause of our suffering. And so the Buddha would say we've got this potential to rid the mind totally of all the ego, all the neuroses, all the fears, all the jealousy, all the anger, which he says is the cause of our suffering and the cause of why we harm others. I mean, look at the world, you know. So the process, the internal process is learning through these meditation techniques to, as one of my teachers says, to be your own therapist, but in a very conscious way, unpacking and unraveling the contents of your own mind, ridding the mind of all the rubbish, all the fears, all the nonsense, fully developing all the goodness, so that eventually you become what they call a fully enlightened being, who then is able to manifest in different bodies throughout universes to help people. That's kind of in essence. Make sense?
So everybody should be getting better.
Well, no, only if you make the if we do the job. If we do the job, you know. If we do the job of consciously, the very first level of practice, just like in any person, is refrain from killing, lying, stealing, and you train your mind in that habit. You know, you live in vows of morality, and then you start to know your mind more, and then you practice compassion wing, and you keep on moving life after life until eventually you've perfected this process. And then you're effortlessly able to manifest around the world benefiting others. That's what they talk about. I remember one time, it was very interesting, in Kathmandu at our centre there, in Nepal, one group of Lutherans came and wanted to have a talk about Buddhism. They came to Kathmandu, so I talked about Buddhism. And we was discussing this view about you get reborn and help others. I remember one of the guys, he was very funny, he said, "Oh God, that sounds terrible. I don't want that," he said. He said, "I want to go to heaven with God when I die, thank you very much." So I kind of, you can see it's quite different. Many similarities, but quite different view, you know. Does that make sense? Darryl? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Kind of. You people, anything. I don't know. Why did you come to hear me? What did you want to hear from me? I have to know what you want to hear from me. Come on, you guys, talk to me. Any old question? I don't mind. Go on. Yes.
What was one of the hardest transitions that there was from Christianity to Buddhism?
For me? Well, it was an evolution, like I said. It was Christianity, hippie, radical left, white, black politics, feminist politics, Buddhism. So it was an evolution. So for me, it sounds cute, it sounds funny the way I put it, but I know in my own constant wish to try to understand the world, and I didn't go to the scientific method, I went sort of more the political method, you understand, trying to understand why the world was suffering. So I went through these different phases of trying to find, really, very consciously, trying to find why there was suffering. Where were the causes of suffering? You understand? So for me, it was an evolution. It wasn't a big leap from one to the other. Do you understand? Does it make sense? Yeah. Very strongly, that was for me. It sounds like different things, but for me, it was a very clear, obvious internal progress that I made. Yeah. Yes, what else?
So here's the big question: we shared this in common. How do we alleviate suffering? What do we do?
Okay, thank you. That's a perfect question, isn't it? Well, this is the Buddhist view. This is where now it sounds quite intense. We can see the world full of, even if we don't think of other creatures, but let's say we can include the ones we see, which is also including the humans and the worms and the kangaroos and the dogs and the fish. For the Buddha, the term that he uses is for all these beings is the word sentient being. And it's interesting, the translation of the Tibetan word is mind possessor. So the Buddha's deal is that there are trillions of mind possessors. And he would assert sentient beings, not just humans and worms and fish, but also ones that are equivalent to the Christians, the occupants of a heaven. He would call them God realm, not God in the sense of creator, but highly subtle beings who are living in bliss with light bodies. They're called the God beings. And then there are humans, then there are animals, then there are beings that are called spirits who are very intensely suffering. And then there are beings called the hell realms. So in many ways, I've over the centuries of different religions, there seems to be many similar observations, but obviously very different interpretations. You understand? And that, I find, that's why for me, I would never criticise any religion. I find it amazing that human beings over the centuries have used their common sense and their intelligence to investigate the meaning of life. I have great respect, So the Buddhist observation, Buddhist view, is that there's all these trillions of sentient beings, and every one of them, necessarily their consciousness, or their mind, or their consciousness. We're not talking the brain here, we're talking your experiential level of thoughts, feelings, emotions, unconscious, like I said before. This consciousness, think of it as like a river of mental moments. This moment of my consciousness, we can track it back, couldn't we? An unbroken chain of mental moments, right back to the first second of conception in my mother's womb. So the Buddha would say, okay, the materialists would say you're just the egg and sperm, mummy and daddy made you. If you're a Christian, God put the soul there, and the Muslims would say the same. The Buddhist view would say, neither of those. Yes, your parents give you a body, how kind of them. But they didn't make you. They provided the means for your consciousness from before in that continuity, from a previous life, not more than a few weeks before, okay? To go into that womb. So the Buddha's view is this is happening for all sentient beings, and what drives that process is not a creator. It's not a random process, and it's not driven by somebody. It's this, like I said before to Darryl, it's this natural process of cause and effect. That every one of those minds, every second, by what they're doing and thinking and experiencing, program their mind that will produce their future experiences. So then suffering experiences, the Buddha would say, are the fruit of past negativity created by that consciousness in who knows what life, could be 1,000 lives ago. What we call happiness, every moment of it, whether it's just getting a nice cake, someone smiling at you, or if it's the suffering of someone being mean to you, whatever the experience is, from the grossest to the most simple to the most complex, the Buddha would say this natural law of karma it's the fruit of seeds or tendencies you put into your mind in the past. And we're all in the same boat. And that one life we're the one who does the harm, next life we're the victim of the same kind of harm. One life we do the virtuous one, next life we receive the result of that virtue. And he says we're doing this countless life after life after life. This is what he would say. So the way to alleviate suffering, it has to start with you. To recognize, the Buddhist view would be, you first take on board, you recognize your suffering. And then you've got to be sick of suffering. And then he would say the main causes of your suffering would be that you can't blame Fred or the next door neighbour, you certainly wouldn't blame God, unless you're Italian. Apparently Italians are very rude about God. Apparently. Anyway, we love to blame mum and dad, you know, we love to blame someone else. The Buddhist idea is not blame. There's no heavy moral overtone there. It's responsible. So when we can be accountable, and I realise that my suffering, which means there's bad things that happen to me, which also means my own ridiculous tendencies, my tendency to be angry, jealous. This is my own stuff that I came programmed with. So by owning responsibility for it in a very kind of adult way, not in a blame, guilty way, I realise, you know what, I'm up to here with suffering. I'm fed up with this. I'm going to change.